Endings and Beginnings. Alice and Arthur. The ending of Alice's life was in fact the beginning of Arthur and Alice's long and happy time together. During both their living times, Arthur in particular, but Alice too, had each been too busy with their own careers to be together. Now Arthur was determined that this would change. 24 hours after she was shot, Alice's ghost appeared on the palace landing stage to find Arthur waiting for her. All ghosts must spend the first year and a day of their ghosthood in the very place where they became a ghost. This is known as their resting time. It can be a difficult time for a ghost who has met an unexpected end, and Arthur was determined that he would stay with Alice for the whole of her resting time and help her through it. He may not have been there for Alice when he should have been while they were living, but he would be there for her from now on. It did not matter to Arthur and Alice whether they were indoors or out. Weather does not generally matter to a ghost, except blustery winds, when a ghost feels blown through. Even Jenna knew this. She hated the idea of Arthur and Alice spending a whole year and a day just drifting around the palace landing stage, so she got Billy Pot to help her set up a large red and white striped tent, or the pavilion as she liked to call it, on the very spot where Alice had been shot. Jenna was glad she had. There were some bad storms that year, but the inside of the pavilion was always an oasis of calm. Jenna was determined to make Alice and Arthur feel at home. The planks of the landing stage were strewn with a thick layer of patterned rugs from the palace, and she filled the pavilion with furniture, cushions, books, and various mementos. There was an ornate inlaid wooden chest, whose open lid revealed many of Alice's favorite treasures from her old warehouse eyrie. A marble chessboard with ships for chessmen, a hand-knitted scarf from one of her many nieces, some letters from Arthur tied up in a red ribbon, and her old judge's wig from many years back. There was Arthur's favorite chair, a moth-eaten old leather thing that Jenna had taken from Sarah Heap's sitting room and placed in a corner next to the pink and gold overstuffed sofa that Sarah had insisted Alice would love. Alice didn't, but a tacky sofa no longer mattered to her in the way that it once would have. Knowing that Arthur and Alice would have many visitors, Jenna had set a low table with a jug of fresh juice, a plate of savory biscuits, and a bowl of fruit for the living. The most regular visitors were Jenna and Silas Heap. Silas could no longer talk to Sarah about Nico, and he needed to talk to someone. Arthur, his old tutor, listened for long hours to Silas, and they had endless discussions about Nico, time, and more recently, forests. Late at night, Silas would stagger back across the long lawns to the palace, feeling as though his head were stuffed full of cotton wool. Arthur did not always look forward to the moment when Silas would stick his head out through the tent flap and say, Arthur, can you spare a few minutes?" But he never refused. Jenna loved the pavilion. Most mornings she would pay a short visit and talk quietly to Alice, who had saved her life. They would chat about Alice's living time, and how much she had enjoyed being a judge at the castle courts in what everyone now called the old days. Alice would tell Jenna about her apartment at the top of the warehouse, which she had loved, and recount the interesting cases she had dealt with as chief customs officer at the port. But sometimes Alice would suddenly get up and say that she must get back to work now, and Jenna would have to gently remind Alice that she was no longer living. Those times were difficult. Alice would grow sad and thoughtful, and Jenna would leave her and Arthur in peace for a few days. That night that Arthur was gathered was the first time he had been away from Alice. Being gathered was a shock to Arthur. All extraordinary wizard ghosts expect it at the end of an apprenticeship, but an unexpected gathering was extremely rare and did not bode well. To Alice's amazement, Arthur was suddenly whisked out of the pavilion, and although her sense of time was still not good, it felt like a few days before she saw him again. Alice loved Arthur and was touched by his sudden devotion, but in life she had been a solitary person who had enjoyed her own company. Arthur's absence gave Alice time to think her thoughts once more, and to begin to understand what had happened to her that afternoon on the palace landing stage. When Arthur returned from the siege, frazzled and very apologetic, Alice was, of course, pleased to see him, but that evening she persuaded him to return to his old habit of visiting the hole-in-the-wall tavern. It would be good for them both, she said. Mrs. Beetle. Pamela Beetle Gurney was not, to her great sadness, married to Brian Beetle for very long. A year after they were married, Pamela gave birth to a baby boy with a shock of black hair and a mischievous smile. The couple had not even registered the birth when Brian Beetle, who worked at the castle dock loading and unloading the port barge, was bitten by a snake that had crawled out of a box of exotic fruit. Brian, as Pamela would sadly tell people many years later, blew up like a balloon and turned blue. No one could save him. A few weeks after Brian Beetle died, the registrar paid Mrs. Beetle a call to inform her that the time limit for registering the baby's name had expired, and she must do so there and then. Mrs. Beetle was in a bad state. The baby cried all night. She cried all day, and the last thing on her mind was what to call her baby boy. So when the registrar got out the ledger of names, dipped her pen in the ink, and very gently asked Mrs. Beetle for the baby's name, all Mrs. Beetle could do was wail, "Oh, Beetle! Beetle!" which was what she had called Brian. Beetle was duly registered as "Oh, Beetle, Beetle." Without Brian Beetle's wages coming in, Mrs. Beetle had to move 2 small rooms at the end of a dingy corridor in the Ramblings. Her family, and Brian's too, lived at the Port and did not offer any help. Mrs. Beetle considered moving back to the Port, but she liked the Ramblings, and her neighbors helped her more, she thought, than her family ever would. And Mrs. Beetle had ambitions for her son. She wanted him to do better in life than work on the docks, and the castle schools provided much better opportunities for a good education than the rough schools in the Port. The young Beetle went to one of the many small good schools in the Ramblings, and Mrs. Beetle worked extra hours as a cleaner to pay for a tutor on Saturday mornings. Beetle was a bright boy, and Mrs. Beetle's ambitions were fulfilled even sooner than she had expected, for he was the youngest person ever to pass the manuscriptorium entrance examination. After Brian died, Pamela had stopped using Gurney, her maiden name, and soon she stopped even using Pamela. Everyone knew her simply as Mrs. Beetle, except for Beetle, who still called her Mum, and didn't care if the scribes teased him. All the scribes referred to their mothers as Mother, if they referred to them at all. But Beetle would often talk about his mother. He worried about her, and wished she could be happy once more. Janet Martin and Nico. When Janet Martin got back to the boatyard after her visit to Sarah Heap, she looked, as Rupert Gringe put it, as though she had had the wind spilled from her sails, and she was wearing a very peculiar hat. Janet was not known for sitting around or gazing into space, but for the rest of the day Janet did both. Even when Rupert showed her the perfect brass fittings he had finally discovered for Janet's pet project that season, the restoration of a rare port sloop, Janet just smiled wanly. Rupert Gringe knew what the problem was. When he had seen Janet set off that morning carrying the indentures, he had guessed what she was doing. Rupert was not a great fan of the Heap family, particularly now that his sister Lucy had run off with Simon Blasted Heap, as Rupert always called him. But he, too, was unhappy about Nico's disappearance. Rupert was not sure he believed all the stories that were going around the castle about Nico being trapped in another time, but it was plain that something nasty had happened to him, and Rupert was very sorry about that. Although at first he had been extremely dubious about Janet taking on a Heap, Rupert had grown to like and respect Nico. He was fun to have around and always willing to sail down to the port and have a laugh, and since Nico had gone, Rupert had realized how much work Nico had done. More than 2 yard hands put together, he told Janet. But even though they could never replace Nico, they needed a new apprentice before the summer season began. That afternoon, when Janet had returned from the palace, Rupert watched her wander slowly over to her ramshackle hut at the entrance to the boatyard. There was a small shed attached to the side of the hut where the junior apprentice slept, and Rupert saw her gingerly push open the door and go inside. Half an hour later, Janet came and found him. "Need a hand?" was all she said. When Janet needed a hand, which was tin trunk with Nico Heap painted on the top in spidery writing, Rupert helped her carry it over to the old lockup. "Keep it in there until he gets back," said Janet. "Yeah, until he gets back," Rupert said. Then he went and sat on the bowsprit of the port sloop for half an hour and watched the muddy waters of the moat drift by. Simon and Lucy. Simon and Lucy made it safely over the river, paid a small fortune to get Thunder out of the ferry stables, and then set off for the port. It was a subdued journey. Being back in the castle had upset them both. Simon had been shocked to see the wizard tower in a state of siege. It made him realize how important the place was to him, and how much he cared that it continued unharmed. And with this insight had come the unwelcome realization that through his actions of the last 3 years he had thrown away any chance he might have had of one day becoming an ordinary wizard, which Simon would have gladly settled for now, and actually being able to live and work in such a wonderful magical place. Now he was unlikely to even see the wizard tower again. Lucy sat behind Simon and looked back mournfully. Thunder trotted briskly along the river-bank path, and as the castle disappeared behind Raven's Rock, Lucy wished she had been brave enough to say hello to her father when she had gone to the gatehouse the morning after they had arrived. He had looked tired and careworn, and so much smaller than she had remembered. Lucy didn't really know why she hadn't dared to tell him she was there. Well, she did know. It was the thought of a full-blown Mrs. Grinch tantrum, but now she really wished she had. How long would it be before she saw her parents again? Years, probably, she thought, and she would never be able to bring Simon to meet them. Not that they would want to, she thought gloomily. As Thunder trotted along in high spirits after leaving the damp and dingy stables, Lucy made an effort to brighten the gloom. "At least Marcia didn't put you up in the lock-up," she said. "She can't be totally mad." "Huh," said Simon's response. But then later, "I hope she looks after Sleuth. That blasted Marin took it before it was completely recharged. I think I'll send her the instructions." "Si, you can't." "Why not?" "Oh, Simon. You don't give up, do you?" "No, Luce, I don't." Marin. The beginning of Marin's employment at the manuscriptorium was not the best. After the shock of being confronted by Simon, and the unexpected loss of Sleuth, Marin ate his entire licorice snake supply. By mid-afternoon he felt sick and very irritable. When Foxy asked him to fetch a copy of the Camel-Leopard Conundrum pamphlet from the Wild Bookstore, Marin, who was terrified of the store after Beetle's lurid tales, told Foxy to get it himself. Foxy looked shocked. Beetle never would have done that. Foxy then proceeded, in Marin's opinion, to get very unreasonable. Marin promptly told Foxy what he could do with his precious camel thingies, and Foxy stomped back to his desk in a huff. Marin listened at the door for a while, but like all listeners, he did not hear anything good about himself. He decided to leave them to it and go stock up on snakes. He snuck out, locking the door behind him to make sure that no customers could get in. Then he crossed Wizard Way and headed into the tangle of alleys that would take him, he hoped, to Ma Custard's all-day, all-night sweet shop. But the alleys were not as Marin remembered them. Someone had changed them just to annoy him. By the time Marin eventually found Ma Custard's, he was very hungry, which was probably why he bought 3 dozen licorice snakes, 2 bags of spider floss, a box of toffee termites, and a whole jar of banana pears. Ma Custard asked Marin if he was having a party. Marin wasn't quite sure what a party was, so he said yes. Ma Custard gave him a tub of crumbly cocoa crumbs for his little friends. Marin decided it was too late to bother going back to the manuscriptorium that day. After eating 3 snakes dipped in cocoa crumbs and 10 banana bears, Marin felt quite brave. He went to the palace kitchen garden, retrieved his things from the horrible shed, and safe in the knowledge that Simon Heap had been thrown out of the castle, he reclaimed his room. The ghost of the governess fled, sobbing, to the old schoolroom. At the manuscriptorium at 5:30 precisely, the scribes leaped from their desks and rushed to the front door. It was locked. The manuscriptorium had a one-and-all spell on the outside doors. If one was locked, all were locked. The scribes had to wait until Jilly Jin emerged from the hermetic chamber some 2 hours later before they could get out. They spent the time discussing in some detail what they intended to do to Marin when they finally got him. When Marin turned up the next day, he had some explaining to do, but he had a good line in Tall Stories, and Jilly Jin, unlike the scribes, believed him. Jilly was not about to admit that she had made a bad choice, and who else but Marin would be perfectly happy counting the entire stock of manuscriptorium used pencils and arranging them according to Miss Jin's new cataloging system, which depended on the number of teeth marks on each pencil. Stanley. The beginning of Stanley's message rat service was not all that he had hoped for. After he had turned down F&I Greaves' offer of staff, Stanley found that word had spread around this reinstated message rat service, and soon a steady trickle of customers found their way to the East Gate lookout tower. Stanley was somewhat irritated by the sudden craze for silly birthday messages among the younger castle inhabitants, and after, for the 3rd time that day, he had flatly refused to sing a birthday greeting, he began to seriously consider packing in the whole enterprise. The night after he had not only been asked to sing a message, but also to perform a dance. Stanley went for a late-night scramble along the outside path to clear his head. Stanley liked the outside path. It ran along the castle walls and was at some points, as Septimus had once found out, nothing more than a narrow ridge. Stanley didn't believe the tales about things walking the path. In fact, he didn't believe in things at all. But it was a dark night, and when, at a particularly narrow and crumbly section, he heard scrabbling and a high-pitched squeaking right in front of him, Stanley suddenly discovered that he did believe in things after all. It was not a good moment, and he very nearly jumped into the moat there and then. But Stanley hated getting wet, and the moat looked dark and cold. He decided that the thing would not be interested in a mere rat, and if he kept very still it would probably go away. But the noises did not go away, and the more Stanley listened, the more he realized how much they sounded like rat squeaks, baby rat squeaks. Dawn was breaking by the time Stanley was back in the East Gate lookout tower, and he was no longer alone. With him were 4 cold, hungry, and very small orphan ratlets. Saira. When Saira saw the long knives of the questing guards, she knew she was in trouble. With no time to say a proper farewell to Julius Pike, whom she loved like a father, Saira was bundled onto the questing boat. As soon as she set foot upon the deck, Saira felt her magical powers drain away. Seen off by the triumphant Tertius Fume, the questing boat set off fast. A magical wind filled its sails, and soon they were sailing past the port and out to sea. Saira refused to go below. She sat shivering in the wind and the rain as the questing boat cut through the waves. Saira stayed awake all through the first night and the following day, eyes wide, hardly daring to even blink, keeping a close eye on the questing guards and their sharp knives. Saira knew that as soon as she fell asleep she was as good as dead, and as the second night on the deck of the questing boat drew on, Saira felt her eyelids droop, and the lure of sleep became irresistible. As she gazed out across the calm sea, watching the distant loom of a lighthouse, the rhythmic movement of the boat lulled her into a brief sleep. She woke with a start to find 3 guards advancing on her with their knives drawn. Saira had no choice. She jumped overboard. The sea was a shock. It was cold, and Saira could not swim. Her heavy robes dragged her down, but as she struggled away from the questing boat, Saira felt her magic return. She called a dolphin, which arrived just as the water was closing over her head for the last time. Lying exhausted on the dolphin's back, Saira found herself heading toward the lighthouse on the horizon. Dolphin and apprentice arrived safely as dawn was breaking. Saira began a new life far away from the castle. She never dared return, but she sent a coded message to Julius Pike to tell him she was safe. Unfortunately, Julius thought it was a final demand for some magical pots he had ordered. He had already paid the bill, so he threw the message down the garbage chute. Morwenna. The moment Morwenna discovered that she had been double-crossed and Jenna and her transformer had fled marked the beginning of a feud between the Wendron Witch Coven and the castle, or rather it was the end of the truce that had existed since Silas, as a young wizard, had rescued Morwenna from a pack of wolverines. Morwenna discovered she had paid her debt to Silas by taking him to his father. The flight of Ephaniah Grebe also angered her. After all she had done for him, he had reneged on his agreement to promise, and she assumed had taken Jenna with him. Camp Heap was placed out of bounds for all the young witches, much to grate their consternation, and the Heap boys suddenly found their lives much less comfortable, Jojo especially. Marissa was forced to choose between Morwenna and Jojo. Marissa was a true witch at heart, and she chose Morwenna. The Towman. The Towman was never a pleasant character. It is doubtful that those who had known him before the thing suddenly appeared in his treehouse would have noticed any difference, apart from the licorice ring. The ring would have puzzled them because it was the Towman's considered opinion that men who wore rings should be shoved off the top of a cliff. That'll show 'em. Whether this showed the Towman himself, no one will ever know. But to be inhabited is not something to be wished upon anyone, however unpleasant. The Towman was up in his treehouse, keeping clear of the forks as he did regularly twice a day, when the thing pushed its way in and made its intentions clear. Then, like Hildegard and Ephaniah before him, the Towman experienced a moment of pure terror, just as some reluctant toll-payers had when they refused him a gold tooth and suddenly found themselves plunging down through the mists of the abyss. Ephaniah Grebe. Ephaniah nearly died in the treehouse beside the bridge. Even though Jenna, Septimus, and Beetle left him as comfortable as they could beneath their wolverine skins, Ephaniah, like Hildegard before him, was overtaken by raging fever and became delirious. If he had not been so weak, it is likely he would, in his confusion, have fallen from the treehouse and died in the snow, or been eaten by the phalanx of forks. But luckily, Ephaniah could do no more than lie on the cold wooden floor, shivering as waves of hot and cold ran through him, and enduring the most frightening nightmares, even worse than those that followed the early days of his rat hex. It was on the mid-morning of his second day in the treehouse, although for all Ephaniah knew it could have been his second month, that his nightmares took on a frighteningly real turn. Overnight his fever had abated a little, and he had regained a little strength. That morning he had rolled over to the door flap and poked his head outside. Luckily he was sensible enough not to tumble to the ground. Instead, he lay on his back, gazing up into the snowy branches, his sensitive rat nose gratefully sniffing the fresh air, and his tiny pink tongue licking the occasional snowflake that came his way. Ephaniah had lain there for some time, and was feeling almost content, when a terrible thud shook the tree, and a great load of snow from the upper branches landed on his face. Shocked, he shook his head, rolled over, and found himself face to face with the most realistic hallucination so far. A huge dragon stood below the treehouse, its long, scaly neck reaching up into the branches, its red-rimmed emerald-green eye staring right into Ephaniah's. A voice from somewhere, a voice that even in his befuddled state Ephaniah thought he recognized but could not quite place, said, "Can you see him, Septimus?" Another voice replied, "It's all right, Misha. He's here. He's okay. You are okay, aren't you, Ephaniah?" It was then that, almost hidden in a dip between the dragon's huge shoulders and the rise of his neck, Ephaniah noticed a small figure with a big smile, and a little further back, sitting uncomfortably between the dragon's spines, a purple-robed woman squinting up at him with glittering green eyes that almost outshined those of the dragon itself. "He looks very heavy," said the purple woman. "He is very heavy," replied the boy. "I don't know how we're going to do it. I'll transport him down onto the snow. Then Spitfire will have to carry him in his talons. Do you think he can do that?" Ephaniah began to realize they were talking about him. It was a horrible nightmare. He wished it would go away. "Easy. Spitfire carried Jen like that once, didn't you, Spitfire?" "You never told me that," said the woman sharply. No, I think I forgot." "A dragon carries the princess in its talons, and you forget?" The nightmare got worse. In fact, it got so bad that Ephaniah lost consciousness once more, and when he awoke a week later in the wizard tower, sick bay, he remembered nothing about a dragon at all. But Spitfire remembered him, and from that day on the dragon never stamped on another rat. Benjamin Heap. Benjamin Heap had no wish to end up as a ghost floating around the castle, getting confused and retreating to the hole-in-the-wall tavern. He wished to end his days in the forest, a place he had always loved, and this is what he did. Benjamin Heap, shapeshifter, became tree. He became one of his favorites, a western red cedar, and stood tall and proud, and slowly growing ever taller. When Benjamin Heap became tree, his thoughts became tree also, but there was always a small part in the core of that western red cedar that was Ben Heap, ordinary wizard, or Grandpa Benji as he was known to his numerous grandchildren. Ben Heap had married Jenna Crackle, sister of Betty Crackle, a white witch, one winter's day in the great hall of the wizard tower. They had 7 sons, and all bar 2, Alfred and Edmund, had had an assortment of children. The forest trees were always listening, people meeting beneath a tree exchanging whispered secrets, travelers talking, voices carried on the wind. The forest trees heard it all. The rustling of leaves in the forest was not always because of the breeze. It was often the trees talking. This is how Benjamin Heap knew about the fortunes of his huge family. It was his youngest son, Silas, his 7th, who he followed the most closely. Silas was born late into the family, and when his last baby boy arrived, Benjamin already felt old. He waited to become tree for as long as he could, but when Silas turned 21, he could wait no longer. Benjamin Heap knew he had to go while he still had the strength to shape-shift into a healthy tree. Silas had missed his father terribly. He had spent many long weeks in the forest looking for him, but he never found him, and when at last, on one of his fruitless searches, he met the young and very pretty Sarah Willow, gathering herbs in the forest, Silas decided he had looked for his father long enough. He and Sarah got married, and Silas settled down to look after his rapidly growing family. Benjamin Heap listened to the forest gossip, so he knew that Silas had had 7 sons. For a long 10 years, he had also known that the youngest grandson was lost, and was in the young army. He had longed to tell Silas where Septimus was, but Silas never came to see him, and there was nothing he could do except make sure that all the forest trees knew to keep Septimus safe on the notoriously dangerous young army exercises. And so, when Morwenna took Silas to see his father, both were overjoyed, although there were serious things to discuss. Silas told his father the dream about Nico in a frozen forest. Benjamin told Silas that the frozen forest had once been warm and friendly, teeming with animals and small, happy settlements. but now it was under a darkness, and it was not a safe place to be. When Silas insisted that he must go, his father very reluctantly told him how to find the forest way. Early the next afternoon, as Silas and Maxie were leaving the ancient glades to start their journey, they met a large shambling figure in white, wearing a small licorice ring on the little finger of its left hand, although Silas was too surprised at bumping into someone in the middle of the forest to notice the ring. When Silas looked at the figure's bottle-glass spectacles, he felt very odd indeed, so odd that he babbled his father's instructions on how to find the forest way, without even being asked. Silas was unaware that he had very nearly been inhabited, but Maxie's long growls, and the sight of the hackles going up on the wolfhound's neck, not to mention his teeth, had persuaded the thing not to bother. Silas never did remember what had happened after he had left Morwenna. He put the lost say down to a witchy hex, and worried about what he had done to offend the witch-mother. He forgot that he had ever met his father. Maxie led Silas back to the castle. When at last, with tired feet and weary paws, they reached the palace, Silas could not find Saira anywhere. Billy Pot told him that Saira had gone off with Marcia on Spitfire, but Silas would not believe him. Why on earth would she want to do that? Billy Pot had shrugged. He didn't know either. But one thing he did know. There was no stopping Marcia when she wanted to fly a dragon. Spitfire. Spitfire liked his new field, and he liked Billy Pot, too. The only thing he missed about the Wizard Tower was his breakfasts. No one made his breakfast quite like Septimus. Naturally, Spitfire wondered where Septimus was, but now that he was nearly full grown, the dragon did not feel the need to see so much of his imprinter. Neither did Spitfire feel the need to see the person who he suspected was his dragon mother in disguise, as some dragon mothers are. But this person, who wore purple and shouted a lot, suddenly seemed to feel the need to see him. But when Spitfire realized that the purple dragon mother had brought with her 4 buckets of sausages and bananas, one of Spitfire's all-time favorites, he changed his mind, and he didn't even mind when the purple dragon mother told him that she was taking the place of his imprinter, and he was to do as he was told. Spitfire would do anything for 4 buckets of sausages and bananas, and that is how Spitfire set off on the longest flight he had ever made. His new pilot did a good job, although her navigator, a thin woman in green, screamed a lot. Spitfire enjoyed the flight. He had needed to stretch his wings, and meeting his imprinter at the other end was good too. It was nice of the purple dragon mother to arrange that for him, but it was a strange place she brought him to, cold, creepy, and suffering from a distinct lack of sausages and bananas. And suddenly there seemed to be a lot of people expecting a ride. They wouldn't all fit on, and there was no point in the purple dragon mother shouting either. Shouting something didn't make it any more impossible. They would have to figure something else out. And where was his dinner?